Senator Johnston.
Well, thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. This is a very important piece of legislation, one which I have to say I would have thought, given recent events in the public domain, particularly Craig Thompson and Mr Michael Williamson, that the Labor Party, in representing the actual workers who subscribe union dues to these unions, would welcome. That is, that any right-minded person seeing some of the most lowly paid workers and union members in our country being just nakedly, cruelly, cold-bloodedly ripped off by the likes of Craig Thompson and Michael Williamson would welcome this legislation, would welcome increased accountability, would welcome greater surveillance of positions of trust by union officials. Now, can I say that having cut my teeth as a young lawyer in Kalgoorlie, acting both for unions and for companies, I'm left with the clear understanding that workforce in certain circumstances do need the representation of the union movement, the labour movement. Indeed, in the 30s in Kalgoorlie, many workers suffered from silicosis, and of course it was the union movement that came to their assistance in dealing with this blight. But when I look at what has been happening, particularly in recent times, the last 10 or 20 years or so, union dues provide a very large pool, a very large corpus of money to be used in administration. And what we have seen with respect to Mr Thompson and Mr Williamson has been a complete breakdown in fidelity and a complete breakdown of trust and loyalty to those hospital service union members. Now, this piece of legislation establishes an independent watchdog, the Commission to monitor and regulate registered organisations with enhanced investigation and information gathering powers. It strengthens the requirements for officers to disclose material personal interests and related voting and decision-making rights, and change grounds for disqualification and ineligibility for office. In other words, increases the surveillance on conflicts of interest so that wives and relatives can't be doing work for the unions, as was the case with Mr Williamson. It strengthens existing financial accounting disclosure and transparency obligations under the Registered Organisations Act by putting certain rule obligations on the face of the Act and making them enforceable as civil remedy provisions. It increases civil penalties and introduces criminal offences for serious breaches of officers' duties, as well as introduce new offences in relation to the conduct of investigations under the Registered Organisations Act. And indeed what it does seem to do, and clearly intends to do, is to bring the obligations upon union members, union officials and those charged with the administration of union funds into the same realm as company directors. And I think that's a very, very good thing, because the fiduciary obligations, the role of the trusting and integrity role that such officials have is very, very similar. Now, the government, of course, is committed to improving the fair work laws so that we can build a more stable, fair and prosperous future for workers, particularly from the perspective of transparency. Transparency as to where a union member's dues go and end up and how they are applied is a very, very important part of the way our industrial laws function. The need for this legislation really does go without saying. We have witnessed massive rorts. We have witnessed racketeering on an amazing scale, the rip-offs that have been the subject of night after night of sensational media reporting. Now, clearly, any responsible government cannot sit on its hands and watch the sort of thing that has gone on, particularly exampled by Thompson and Williamson. Now, the charges and allegations against both of those people in their capacity as officers of the Health Services Union were quite simply shocking and completely, may I say, Mr Acting Deputy President, completely unacceptable. Thompson was arrested in respect of more than 150 fraud-related charges and is facing allegations that his 2007 election campaign was partly funded by siphoning union money without authorisation. Mr Williamson pleaded guilty to misusing almost $1 million of Health Service Union members' funds. Now, I pause to say that I think we can all acknowledge that Health Service Union members, that is, those men and women inside hospitals who do the cleaning, the menial tasks, are some of the lowest paid people in Australia today. And Mr Williamson clearly, in a very callous, cold-blooded way, simply ripped them off. Just ripped them off. Now, I find that completely unacceptable, totally unacceptable, and anybody who wants to say that that's not representative, the Royal Commission is setting out, and we've seen charges from the Royal Commission, the Royal Commission is setting out a litany of this sort of abuse of power by union officials. So, members of the Health Services Union are asking how this gross breach of trust, the Thompson and Williamson sagas, can occur. Now, the obligation on this Parliament is to firstly respond to, and I underline, that Mr Williamson has pleaded guilty. That is, he has admitted and accepted that in a guilty way he simply stole the money of the members of this union. He has accepted that he was and is dishonest and ripped these people off. Accordingly, the government seeks to act. And I think this legislation is very well balanced in seeking, as I've said, to increase the transparency, to provide the powers, the transparent powers for a commissioner to investigate such matters. So the bill introduces a suite of measures designed to see governance of registered organisations lifted to a consistently high standard across the board. I think that is just so understandable in the face of what we've witnessed, and so required that the Parliament and the government, of course, should be congratulated for responding in the way that it has with this legislation. A more robust compliance regime will deter wrongdoing and promote first-class governance of registered organisations. To improve oversight of registered organisations, the bill will establish a dedicated, as I've mentioned, an independent watchdog, the Commission, the Registered Organisations Commission, to monitor and regulate registered organisations and provide them with enhanced investigation and information gathering powers. The new Commission will have the necessary independence and the powers it needs to regulate registered organisations effectively, efficiently and transparently. The Commission will be headed by the Registered Organisations Commissioner, who will be appointed by the Minister. The Commission will have stronger investigation and information gathering powers than those that currently apply. These will be modelled on those available to the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, which will further enhance the ability of the Commissioner to provide strong and efficient regulation of unions and employer associations. The Commission will have the power to commence legal proceedings and to refer possible criminal offences to the DPP or law enforcement agencies. Can I also mention that we are increasing in this legislation the penalties? So for serious contraventions, there'll be an increase. The maximum penalty will be increased to 1,200 penalty units, which is approximately $200,000. I think the units are worth $170 per unit. And for corporate breaches, the penalties will be increased to 6,000 penalty units, which is around about $1 million. Now, I think these sorts of penalties for the sorts of breach of trust, breach of faith and abuse of power are very, very appropriate, Mr Acting Deputy President. Look, I want to pause to just go over why we are doing this. Why is the government doing this? And of course, I need go no further than to deal with what happened with respect to Mr Craig Thompson, who was in fact a Labor Party member of this Parliament. The Fair Work investigation into the Hospital Services Union National Office identified a total of 181 contraventions of the Registered Organisations Act. And the HSC and the Hospital Services Union rules by the union officials and others. The claim against Mr Thompson included 37 alleged breaches of general duties imposed on officers of registered organisations and 25 alleged breaches of the Hospital Services Union rules. Mr Thompson was convicted of criminal charges in the Melbourne Magistrates Court on the 18th of February 2014. He subsequently appealed and was convicted of 13, to the best of my understanding, 13 charges of theft. As outlined in a statement made by the Fair Work Commission General Manager Ms Bernadette O'Neill on the 18th of February, Mr Thompson's criminal conviction will impact the civil proceedings, as the Registered Organisation Act provides that any corresponding civil proceedings that have been stayed will automatically be dismissed. So let's deal with what was confronting law enforcement agencies when an investigation was carried out into the activities of Mr Thompson. On the 31st of January 2013, Mr Thompson was arrested by New South Wales Police in relation to allegations of fraud against the Hospital Services Union by Victorian Police. The trial began on the 2nd of December 2013, Mr Thompson pleading not guilty to over 145 fraud-related charges. On the 18th of February 2014, Mr Rosenschwag found Mr Thompson guilty of using credit cards issued to him in his role as National Secretary of the Health Services Union between 2002 and 2007. So that for 5 years, this person apparently treated the Hospital Services Union as his own private banker. Magistrate, well, I'm happy for Senator Cameron to defend this person.
Order.
He can't resist interjecting, Mr Acting Deputy President, because he knows this is an absolute blot on the Labor movement. And the Labor movement does have a lot to be proud of. This is not one of those things. This is a disgrace. And the sooner Senator Cameron owns up to the
Senator
fact
Johnston,
that,
direct your comments through the chair,
thank you,
please.
Mr Deputy President. The sooner Senator Cameron owns up to the fact that this legislation will stop the likes of Craig Thompson and Michael Williamson, the better off we'll all be. So that on the 25th...
Order.
Sorry, Mr Magistrate...
Senator Cameron, order on my left.
The magistrate found Mr Thompson guilty of stealing HSU funds and obtaining financial advantage by deception when he used the union's credit card to pay for escort services, cigarettes, firewood, travel expenses for his ex-wife, and to withdraw nearly $10,000 in cash from ATMs. On the 25th of March 2014, Mr Thompson received a sentence of 12 months imprisonment, but with 9 months suspended. Mr Thompson launched an appeal, and as I've said, I think 13 of those charges of theft were sustained upon appeal. Mr Thompson was formally expelled from the Labor Party on the 4th of April 2014. Bear in mind, these offences were carried out between 2002 and 2007. So more than 7 years after the offences that Mr Thompson had been charged with, was he expelled from the Labor Party. On the 4th of October, if I may, Mr Acting Deputy President, in the short time available to me, turn to Mr Michael Williamson. On the 4th of October 2012, former Hospital Services Union National President, and may I say former National President of the Labor Party of Australia, Australian Labor Party, Mr Michael Williamson was arrested by New South Wales Police and charged with 20 criminal offences. Mr Williamson was charged with a further 30 offences before all 50 charges were combined into 4 major charges. On the 15th of October, Mr Williamson pleaded guilty to those 4 charges, including defrauding the Hospital Services Union of almost $1 million through the creation of false invoices. He was also charged with 2 new counts over his alleged attempts to hinder police investigations. So not only did he ultimately accept his guilt, but he also accepted that he sought to avoid that guilt by hindering police investigations. This was a man who was the President of the Australian Labor Party. President of the Australian Labor Party. What a blot on the landscape for that political movement. A full-day sentence hearing was held on the 3rd of March 2014. A full day's hearing was held on the 3rd of March in the New South Wales District Court.
Order in the chamber.
On the 28th of March 2014, Judge David Frierson of the New South Wales District Court sentenced Mr Williamson to 7.5 years imprisonment. He'll be eligible for parole after 5 years. This person who just callously ripped off the workers in the Hospital Services Union was the President of the Australian Labor Party. On the 4th of April 2014, Mr Williamson was formally expelled from the Labor Party at a meeting of the New South Wales Administrative Committee. Media reported in October 2013 on a settlement of $5 million between Mr Williamson and the New South Wales Division. So he was charged with $1 million, but the settlement to the union was $5 million. So clearly, in a civil sense, the breach was even bigger than the criminal offences. Now, this is an absolute disgrace, and clearly the law was inadequate. The assistance that the legislation gave to the investigators was inadequate, and we seek to remedy that problem right here and right now. Now, in an article in the Australian Financial Review on the 11th of December, it reported that the New South Wales Division of the Hospital Services Union was attempting to recover an additional $2.4 million it alleges was overcharged under a secret commission arrangement involving former Secretary Michael Williamson, his ex-mistress Cheryl McMillan, and a former director of a supplier to the union, Mr Alf Downing. Proceedings against Mr Williamson did not proceed due to a settlement being reached. However, proceedings against Ms McMillan and Mr Downing are continuing with the next hearing, with hearings going on. Of course, on the 16th of October 2013, the members of that union were given the happy news, and I say that sarcastically, Mr Acting Deputy President, that Mr Williamson had applied for bankruptcy, so that the union members received no justice whatsoever in this. And of course, Mr Williamson did not give the union back the money that he had purloined nefariously. And of course, we then saw what happened with respect to Ms Kathy Jackson. It was reported that she had used legal fees totalling several $100,000 to defend matters which she was unauthorised to defend, and that the union, the Hospital Services Union, is seeking some $400,000 with respect to unauthorised use of funds. Now, those 3 examples, in my respectful opinion, Mr Acting Deputy President, mean that this legislation is necessary, and this Parliament must continue a very active surveillance, as it does with company directors, as it does with people charged with the administration of monies, from membership subscriptions, from shareholders. It is all very, very similar. The common threads are obvious. And people who seek to say that this legislation is wrong and not needed, are living in a dream world. Thank you.